Hi all, thanks for joining today's Zadara webinar. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. Hey, good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for joining Zadara's webinar. We'll get started in just another minute or two. Thank you. All right, good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to today's Zadara webinar. Today's living on the edge, how MSPs and hosting providers can leverage the edge without the public cloud. We've got a great topic today and a great guest from IDC. Before we get started, let's just kind of introduce ourselves to you guys and cover a couple logistics. Dave, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, Steve, and thanks again for inviting me to today's webinar. So my name is Dave McCarthy. I'm a research vice president at IDC. For those not familiar, IDC is a market intelligence and advisory services firm for the technology industry. And so we have 1,100 analysts around the world that look at all sorts of different topics, the impact of technology and how customers and businesses are navigating them. And so excited to be here today to talk about edge computing specifically.
Super. Thank you, Dave. And again, yeah, my name is Steve Bohek. I'm the head of product marketing here at Zadara. I'll get into the agenda here in just a second. Before I do, we've got a pretty good presentation. I'd say it's about 45 minutes or so. So we'll have time at the end to handle questions. Probably best that we do not handle them during our presentation. So we're going to hold them to the end, but we don't want you guys to be shy either. So please use the Q&A function as part of the Zoom webinar today to enter your questions. And then when we're done speaking at the end, we'll kind of go through and address them that way. So please use the Q&A function for that. Otherwise, sit back, relax. We got a great topic today and looking forward to chat with you guys. So from an agenda perspective, Dave and I are going to kind of split this up. Want to cover some of the high level marketing kind of trends and what's going on from the edge side. We'll talk about how we define, or how IDC define edge, which is pretty much in line with how we define it at Zadara. Challenges, opportunities going on at the edge. And then we're going to transition to some of the things Zadara has going on in these areas. So that's kind of a very high level agenda. We got a lot of good content for you guys. And without further ado, Dave, I'll turn it over to you, please.
Yeah, that's great. So so today's topic, of course, is to put some focus on edge computing. And we'll be talking about, I'll be talking about what it is, why people are caring about it, and what role MSPs can play in it. Because in many ways, if you think about the trends over the last 10 years, which is really this move towards cloud technology, it was very an inward focused kind of situation where more things were becoming centralized, whether through like data consolidation or whether it was that move to public cloud. And I think businesses achieved a lot of advantages from doing that. But at the same time, I think they determined there were certain limitations in what was happening. And so all of a sudden, edge computing was brought into the picture, not to replace cloud, but to be a complement. So Steve, if we move to the next slide, I think the very first thing that is important is to sort of level set on what we mean by edge computing. And it's fairly true to say that if you ask 10 different people what their definition of edge computing is, you might get 10 different answers. And they're not necessarily wrong. I think the reason why there can be some confusion is because there is some contextualness to the way that people view edge computing. But when you look at sort of two key things that remain true, regardless of how people define it, it is this move to a distributed computing paradigm. So I mentioned earlier about how there was all of this centralization happening in data centers and public clouds. And so now that sort of that pendulum is swinging the other way to a distributed model. And part of this is because there is a need to be able to move compute and applications and workloads closer to where data is both generated and consumed. And that's really important because when IDC looks at where the growth of data is happening today, it's not in the data center. Whether fueled by IoT or digital transformation efforts, we're seeing more and more data being created in the field. And so when we look at this, the way IDC organizes its research around where the sort of spectrum of compute and workloads can live, it is this move from core, and again, that core can either be a public core infrastructure or private infrastructure, out to this like levels of edge, and then all the way out to the endpoint. And so I heard once somebody say to me that, back to that, how do you define edge and why is it different? I mean, there is some element of edge being in the eye of the beholder, but I think if you kind of keep these two ideas in mind, they normally ring true regardless on the situation that you're looking at. And so going to the next slide, I guess we should ask ourselves, why all of a sudden is this becoming important? Like, what are the motivations? What are some of those limitations that people found when moving to a centralized computing model? And you can break them into, roughly two buckets, right? There's the technology side of what's going on in the space, and then there's the business side. And on the technology side, we can start with something as clear as like bandwidth intensive applications. And so you look at, even like content delivery networks as being one of the early, prior to the term edge being a term, this idea of distributed, like moving, content closer to where users were, because of the fact that networks were constrained in what they could communicate. And that was causing, bad user experiences and even some limitations in terms of the types of products and services that people could offer. And when you combine kind of that bandwidth intensive situation with latency sensitive applications, it's sort of like a 1-2 punch of trouble for centralized models. And we're seeing a lot of these latency sensitive applications show up in real-time industries. So you look at things like manufacturing that requires milliseconds matter, and the things that they're doing, that kind of round trip to the cloud doesn't work. I mean, you can find this in healthcare, you can find it in retail. Almost every industry has some element where they need more real-time response in this. And it's not just for that, being able to do things now, but it's also to be able to do things consistently over time. So this idea of resiliency in operations, something that I personally don't hear as much as I would expect in some of these edge computing scenarios, but I think you'll hear more. And it really just, goes back to the idea that every major cloud provider has had some sort of an outage over the last year. And so if you're a business that needs to continue to operate, and you've relied solely on a cloud resource, what do you do? So people are looking at resiliency and distributing some of this compute as a way of addressing that. And then also kind of wrapped up in this whole technology conversation is scalability. When you start looking at even back to that IoT conversation of more and more connected devices that are scattered all across the world, the idea that you could shoot all of that data to some central source in any kind of an efficient manner just doesn't work, right? So to be able to scale out some of these things, and you see this become even more of a problem as you get into some of the workload trends that you hear, right? Everybody's trying to figure out, like, how do I leverage more data to make my business more competitive or to gain more insight? And so like that AI concept, which also really heavily relies now on kind of these distributed models is important. But there's also the business side. We talk about companies wanting to increase the level of innovation or the pace of innovation to launch new products and services, or just to become more agile. I don't want to dwell on the events of the last 18 months, but I think almost every business realized that bad things can happen that are unexpected. And so how quickly can you sort of retool what you're doing to address either new operating environments or new customer requirements? All of that I think is enhanced through the level of adding edge as a sort of a complement to what's happening in sort of centralized cloud or data center resources. Not to mention things like security and compliance. You hear a lot about this in Europe with GDPR, right? The whole data sovereignty and more rules around where data can be stored and where it can be communicated to. And it's happening in the US as well. The California Consumer Privacy Act is one example. And I suspect over time, we're going to see more rules around this. And so again, you want to be able to have the ability to place the infrastructure, place the data where it's required. And then finally, there's a cost benefit in many cases of going to the edge, because if you can limit that movement of data, then you're reducing sort of cloud storage costs, you're reducing the communication costs to be able to transmit that. And so while not every business will identify with all 8 of these, I think that when you start looking at these scenarios, combinations of these kind of arise depending on the use case and depending on the type of company that you are. So Steve, let's go to the next slide, because I wanted to put this in the context of how customers are thinking about this, right? And when we ask people, we do surveys on a regular basis to really get to that sort of buyer sentiment of what people are thinking about. And we've been drilling into edge computing now for at least the last year or so, and it has emerged as a strategic imperative. And what I mean by that is just become a top priority, where it's not just buried somewhere within a technical organization saying, oh yeah, hey, maybe there's a cool technology that we can deploy, but businesses are realizing that this is important for them to address some of those issues on the previous slide. And when we asked them, 73% said they view edge as strategic. And then on top of that, 17 have already gotten to the point where it's required by business operations. And we suspect at IDC that as we go forward over the next couple of years, that required by operations is going to increase. And it's going to increase because of the fact that whether it's the performance side of things or whether it's the security side of things, these are both issues that are increasingly showing up in the C-suite. And one of the things that IDC does, like many research firms, is try to pull out our crystal ball. And it's not just a random crystal ball, it's informed by both the market data that we have and the survey information that we collect, but that by 2023, 50%, or actually more than 50% of new enterprise IT infrastructure will be deployed at the edge, up than 10% today. This was actually from last year, so I think we're already past that. And so this sort of shift, and we see this in the shift of spending, it's not that IT budgets are shrinking, but that composition of whether I put that in a centralized place or whether I put that at the edge is absolutely changing. And a lot of that is driven by this 800% predicted increase in the number of apps at the edge. In some cases, these are net new applications. In other cases, these are companies taking existing applications, especially as they get into that cloud native mindset where they're not monolithic anymore. They can actually break them up and distribute different functions to where they run the best. That's repeatedly coming up in the types of conversations that we have. And I mentioned that a lot of this is also driven by the second futurescape prediction around where this processing needs to happen, especially driven in some of these IoT use cases. By 2023, 70% will be running some level of data processing at the edge, and organizations will be spending over $16 billion on that infrastructure over that course of time. I mean, it's something that we've seen grow. And I think in some respects, edge computing has been kind of that missing link between a couple of other industry trends like 5G and IoT and AI. And then you add edge computing. It's all of the building blocks are now in place to unlock a new set of capabilities and benefits. So let's go to the next slide, because we asked people, where do you think these benefits are going to come from? And we've been asking also this question over time to kind of track some of the differences. And what's emerged to us is that you can break this also into kind of short-term and long-term benefits. Back to that kind of business agility, and sometimes digital transformation is also kind of overlaid into that. And to me, digital transformation is an interesting concept, but it sounds like it's like a one-time effort, like I do something and now I'm digitally transformed and I can go home. But the reality is it's a combination of like digital transformation plus continuous innovation results in something that we're calling at IDC like digital resiliency. And digital resiliency is not a one-time thing. It's something that you sort of embed into the culture of your business. And the reason why people are doing this is because of increased productivity, because they can make faster decisions, and they can do all of that wrapped into this idea of improved security and compliance. Like these are kind of like some hot buttons that, if you go to somebody and say, hey, are these things that are important to you? They're always going to say yes. And then you start talking to them about, well, why maybe are you not achieving them today? And you start running into some of those limitations of those cloud environments. And that's how all of a sudden edge gets injected into the conversation. And there's certainly more on the list here that you can read through in terms of places that people are thinking about this. But that last one in orange, we highlighted as a small one today because, it's kind of like you have to build the foundation of your house before you can do all the new cool things that sit on top of it. But that new product and service opportunity is becoming increasingly important because we see people, and it's tied a little bit to that higher one around improved customer experience. But but as businesses sort of rethink their business models and they themselves move into sort of a more kind of as a service way of thinking, all of this kind of is facilitated by the infrastructure and the things that underpin all of this new technology. So let's go to the next slide, because I wanted to kind of map out, the sort of landscape of where we see edge computing happening, because it's even though it's easy for people to talk about it kind of in a duality, like you have cloud and you have edge, the reality is that there's layers to this, and you can kind of break these between things that you see in edge computing on the service provider sort of facility side and things that you see on the customer facility side. And so it's kind of walking, left to right, starting of course with the, sort of centralized like hyperscale regions. Of course, those are not edge, but I put them there for illustrative purposes. And then you start getting into that metro regional area. And this is an area that you see public cloud providers starting to invest in, but they have a long way to go to get to any sort of coverage that would meet, most of the demand. And you're starting to see some early rollout of these MEC services, which are really the cloud providers working in conjunction with telecommunication companies. So MEC stands for multi-access edge compute. So they're starting to build into those kind of areas. And then of course, customers will be looking at edge in terms of on-premises location. And if you get really down to what you might want to call the absolute edge, you're embedded right into the device itself. And so this is a spectrum of places. And ultimately, what I think will happen as these solutions mature, and I've seen some early indications of this already, is that everybody will sort of plant their flag in one of these areas to say, here's where I'm going to do my very first kind of edge deployment and take advantage of this. But over time, it'll be also a combination of these types of deployment models because of that latency spectrum on the right. Not every application that somebody needs or needs ultra low latency, like right on the device itself. There will be need, though, to aggregate some of that on premises. There's going to be need to aggregate some of that, within a regional area, and then ultimately globally, perhaps in the public cloud. And so it creates that kind of spectrum. And this is another area that we've been drilling into also. So Steve, going to the next slide around, where people are putting this, you can see that it's fairly well distributed today. And some of this, also relates to, the different kind of management styles or management services that are layered on top of these. And so when you look at something like, telco infrastructure as being, one area of this, that kind of maps to that MEC concept I mentioned earlier. and things like robo in our terminology is remote office, branch office, which would, sort of relate to, things like on-premises facilities. But when you get to that sort of lower right of this, you're seeing a lot of things that, potentially are opportunities for service providers, both, in the field, in IDC, in this particular survey was meant to indicate, all of these vertically specific kind of locations, servicing, factories and warehouses and hospitals and schools, and all of this kind of distributed infrastructure is one area. Co-location showing up as a strong representation of the way that people think about edge, because, in some cases, I guess enterprises might, outsource their entire sort of core infrastructure to a co-location facility. But in other cases, they're using it to service like regional sets of users. And when they do it, that's completely an edge story for me. And you're seeing them do this not just within country, but then starting to, almost all these companies that end up with international operations, and so they need kind of pockets of infrastructure. And so co-location is playing a bigger piece of that. And then these, kind of cloud edge data centers, which in some respects represents a little bit of what the public cloud providers are doing, but also represents other providers that are providing cloud-like services, but putting them at the edge. Again, it's a very locational, kind of view. There's opportunity here, I think, for all of these different scenarios. And, as we kind of look forward, we'll continue to see, how some of these, sort of emerge over time. So one more slide here on just some general market stuff. And this would be, the next survey slide that we have on edge deployment challenges. Because so if you've bought into the concept I've tried to lay out here today, that edge is important for a lot of reasons, it's becoming strategic for companies, there's benefits. Those last couple of slides around all these different locations and this whole distributed concept is challenging for companies to adopt. And a lot of them talk, identify like training and how to operate this environment as being a potential inhibitor. Not to mention things like understanding, how to get enough bandwidth between locations, and what does this mean in terms of like process and opportunity. And so what this is driving, what we've noticed is, sort of two camps within the edge kind of enterprise community. I mean, there's certainly the companies that have invested in the skill sets and want to own and operate and, kind of the DIY, do it yourself. But more and more of these companies are looking towards, managed solutions as a way of getting over this. They want the easy button in a way, just like they had it in the cloud, public cloud, of saying that, hey, I don't have to manage any of this. I can kind of just consume it as resources. They're looking for that same kind of advantage, but again, addressing those limitations of public cloud and having that cloud-like experience at the edge. When I ask a company if they could get all of that anywhere they wanted it, they resoundingly say yes. And so, my final slide here before we transition over to Steve was to kind of highlight this a little bit in terms of the opportunities for MSPs. And some of this relates to, sort of forecast data. So when we publish what we call our Edge Spending Guide on a semi-annual basis that counts up, all the money that both enterprises and service providers are spending on edge technology across 18 different markets. And when we zoom in specifically on IaaS, you can see that in 2021, we're looking at $898 million worth of spend. But in just 4 more years, we're forecasting that to be 20 billion. And this isn't your typical kind of investor pitch where we show you the hockey stick and say, oh yeah, this is what it is. This is actually based on real projections that we're getting from the industry, based on the trajectories that we're seeing and the growth and interest that we're seeing in here. We very much believe in these numbers and have ways of backing them up. So for somebody looking at getting into like, how do I provide edge IaaS services, there is a lot of room of opportunity. And then, this is from our most recent survey that we put out there when we started talking about asking organizations, like, what is your like next adoption of edge? We already had 50% of people coming in there and saying, well, we're already doing edge, but we're also planning to open either more edge locations or getting into the edge market within the next 24 months. And very few people don't identify with this, right? That say either I don't know what it is or I don't want to do this. So I guess I'll sort of sum up here by saying that while edge seems to have come out of nowhere, in the last couple of years as a key industry topic. It has gained traction. We believe at IDC that it will continue to gain traction. So then, the challenge becomes for somebody like an MSP is, how do I get into this business? How do I do it in a way that solves some of these problems that we talked about earlier? And so for that, I think that Zadara has a very interesting value proposition for this. And so I'd like to turn it over to Steve so he can explain how Zadara fits into the sort of this edge landscape.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. That was fantastic. And yeah, so let me just kind of, we'll transition here. So yeah, Dave covered some of the edge specific topics, which was terrific. There's some really interesting data on those slides. As he said, let me talk a little bit about Zadara, what we have around edge. We've got a couple things I'll touch on, but let's just kind of dive right in on Zadara Edge Cloud services. So I suspect that many folks on this call, this may be your first kind of view or an introduction to Zadara. So let me just kind of back up and just take a couple quick slides to just kind of talk about Zadara. By the way, there's a kind of a sister webinar we did about a month ago that is specifically focused on our product line, and we also did it with a colleague of Dave's on the IDC side too. So if you want to see a deeper drill down of our products and offerings, that's a good webinar to check out. We've got it on demand on our website. So, so Zadara, if you're not familiar with Zadara, we do kind of fully managed infrastructure as a service. We do a lot of work with MSPs and MHSPs, hosting service providers, which I'll come back to in a minute. But we also do some end customer work. And this slide is a good kind of view of kind of the three pillars as we view our business. So the first one is the kind of the technology. So it's fully featured. As you'll see in a minute, we offer compute as a service, storage as a service, and networking capabilities. And it's enterprise grade. For those of you who are deeply familiar with Zadara, you may know that we started as a storage as a service. That was like our initialization as a company, and we have since added compute to that as well. So the very similar kind of feature set that you would expect out of like a cloud provider, really enterprise grade. From the compute side with vCPUs and associated memory, which is EC2 compatible. On the storage side, we have SSDs, HDDs for lower cost storage. In-flight and at-rest encryption, snapshots, mirroring, HA, cloning. I mean, everything you would expect from an enterprise grade infrastructure as a service provider. So that's the technology. From a business model perspective, it's fully elastic, consumption based. It's 100% operating expenses based. So there's zero CapEx aspect to our business. It is all intended to be consumption, pay as you go kind of pricing and consumption. And as you'll see in a minute, we do things on premise with our customers, but the majority of our business is through customers and partners, where we are kind of the arms provider to them, and then their services are built on top of our technologies. So anyway, that's the consumption model. And then the last part, excuse me, is it all is fully managed by Zadara. Doesn't matter where it's deployed, it's fully managed by us 24/7. So a lot of those headaches of managing upgrades, whether it's software or hardware, migrations, we handle all that. So, all that burden is really, removed with our partners and customers. And that's a big reason why we see this business, because can be quite a headache all on its own. So at a high level, that's kind of who Zadara is and what we do. Quickly, again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but from the technology and product side, as I mentioned, the three main products we have are Z Compute, Z Networking, and Z Storage. As I mentioned, the Z Compute services are fully EC2 compatible because we do see a fair amount of interest and business come from the larger cloud providers, like AWS as an example. So having that EC2 compatibility is really helpful for customers and partners who come from that kind of background. That it's an easy kind of transition over to our stuff on the compute side. And then, as I mentioned, Z Storage, we unified storage offering with block, file, and or object all on the same operating platform or storage platform. The next thing I'll say before I kind of transition over and talk about partners for a few minutes is, so I mentioned a second ago there about a lot of people moving over for public cloud, and well, why is that? The other thing that I meant to mention on the previous slide is that a lot of people are very surprised and impressed really how simple our pricing is. You know, our model is very straightforward. We don't have a lot of additional charges. We don't charge for ingress and egress of the data, as an example. So it's really pretty simple, and it's therefore relatively easy to predict if you have a relatively good understanding of your workloads. And that is an area where the public clouds are starkly different. You know, it can be very complicated, very difficult to predict, and therefore can be very expensive and very spiky, month to month. Certainly things can change month to month. No one has constant kind of workloads necessarily. But that being said, you'll see a much smoother kind of model with us because of our pricing being really, really pretty simplified. So just wanted to say that quickly. So I mentioned that also a minute ago, we are pretty laser focused on MSPs and hosting service providers. Excuse me. So not to say we haven't done business with end customers. We do have a decent amount of business with larger kind of on-premise end customers, but the lion's share, I would say, of our business and really our go-to-market model is primarily focused on partners and specifically hosting service providers and managed service providers. That is very much in our DNA. We have a big, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, but we have a whole partner onboarding program, kind of a checklist for the first, say, quarter we do business. We do a lot of co-marketing activities with you to help you get up to speed on generating demand around Zadara products, and even for smaller MSPs, also just helping to kind of buttress some of those sales motions, especially if you're growing. But anyway, a large network of partners and providers, some obviously not so small when you look at some of the names on this slide, but that is very much how we do business and where we're going. Kind of then the graphical view of this then is, as you saw on the last slide, 300, we call them clouds worldwide. Basically, cloud is like a physical deployment. So it's pretty strong presence worldwide. Actually, I just realized this slide's a little dated. I think this says 280 petabytes deployed. It's actually over 300 at this point. So we've got a pretty decent amount of storage out there. And then from a partner perspective, we're kind of constantly growing, but we're between the 250 and 300 mark for number of partners worldwide. So like I said, very much part of our model. Now, one thing I want to point out, or maybe I'll say foreshadow, is that one thing you can see here is, especially looking at North America as an example, a lot of coverage geographically there across the North America, really, including Canada. And if you map on top of that, then as an example, AWS locations, you can quickly see there may be some areas where if you're, say, an AWS customer in the Midwest or even the mountain region of the US, maybe if you have very latency sensitive, bandwidth sensitive applications, that could be a bit of an issue for you. And that's one of the areas we see interest. And that then kind of begins to tie into some of the edge things we've been talking about until now. I know Dave had, excuse me, on his, I think one of his earlier slides, he was mentioning bandwidth and latency challenges. And that's very much, we see a lot of that. And that's going to nicely transition into some of the edge stuff I'll talk about here in a minute. So I just wanted to kind of lay that groundwork for you. Before I do that, kind of also kind of tailoring into or continuing some of the last MSP challenges Dave was talking about. From our side, like I said, we're so focused on MSPs, obviously, we talk to a lot of them. What we've seen right now is basically two general kind of evils or struggles. They have one major struggle with two kind of evils they're challenged to kind of deal with. And the major struggle is, continuing growth and continuing growth profitably. And the challenge for them is, especially if it's a small, regional MSPs, which they tend to be, generally speaking, is how to expand, beyond maybe their local county, state, and to grow their business. And it's hard because once they want to grow their infrastructure, they're looking at two basic options, and that's what this table is getting into. Option one, you can procure and deploy more of your infrastructure, more than likely at a co-location provider. The issue with that is more often than not, that's going to be a large CapEx investment for the equipment. There's of course the cost and the time to spin up that site. You know, if it's a new site, you got to get it deployed and operating and test it out and everything. You're probably going to need some additional staff to manage that new equipment. So then therefore the whole time to market for this new offering is going to be rather lengthy and potentially expensive, again being a CapEx investment. So that's not necessarily ideal for those reasons. The other way to handle this problem or check out problem is then you could deploy maybe on AWS or even one of the hyperscalers to tackle it that way. Well, as we saw in the last slide, potentially there's going to be there's too few of those zones which may not provide low enough latency, say, for your application or what your customers are demanding. It can be expensive and unpredictable, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah, so it's not a CapEx investment, it's going to be OpEx. But as I mentioned a couple slides ago, more than likely it's going to be pretty expensive, and it could be also very unpredictable in terms of trying to understand, you know, the month-to-month predictability of what your costs could look like. Because we've seen and heard some real horror stories from some of the partners we work with and have talked to. So that's pretty ugly. And then, by the way, you know, these hyperscalers are trying to grow themselves, and we've also heard of instances, unfortunately, where they may just kind of end up going direct to your customer anyway and kind of cutting the MSP out of the equation. So neither of these options is really ideal. And by the way, especially in the second one, you know, the margins that you're going to see as a partner for your business are probably not going to be where you'd want them to be either. So, you know, it's kind of choosing between two evils, which leads me to the quote at the bottom was, yeah, I'm looking for a provider who can give me that high latency, unpredictable pricing, low margins, and may steal my customer, said no MSP ever. So not an ideal situation. So then that gets us into what we're going to be doing, or we have been doing, with the federated edge. So now I want to transition to that map I referred to a minute ago into our federated edge program. And the federated edge then now is creating the world's largest public edge cloud with more global points of presence than any edge provider. So here's a slightly different view of basically of the same map I was showing earlier. So what the federated edge is we've taken all those deployments worldwide and all the partners worldwide, and we saw that and heard some of these struggles and said, well, what if there's a way that you guys could have access to each other's technologies, which is all Zadara based anyway, so Zadara is managing it anyway. And we've created this federated edge program of our partners, which basically, through Zadara's provisioning portal, and again, it's going to be all on Zadara equipment, you can now access each other's Zadara-based deployments. So in other words, if you're that regional provider, let's say on the East Coast of the US, and you have some potential business on the West Coast, maybe you had to walk away from that business in the past because you couldn't meet it. But now, using the federated edge program, you would have access through Zadara's program to potential resources out on the West Coast, depending on where where on the West Coast you're looking for, that you could have some now storage based out there or additional compute resources based on there to, again, as Dave was mentioning, right, be closer to where that data is going to be consumed or generated than before. And that's the beauty of the federated edge network. We've got more and more partners joining the program. And so more and more of these sites are kind of becoming live weekly, almost on a daily basis. So that's basically, what the program really is. And we use this term FE zones to refer to all the different sites of our partners that are part of this program, and leveraging those sites for each other's business. And the beauty of the last thing I'll mention too, before I get into some of the benefits straight ahead, is that now as a partner, you're going to get margins either way on this side of it, right? Because if you're a partner, if you're that East Coast partner, you're still going to get the business from your customer and the margins therein for providing that business. And if you're that West Coast partner that is accepting the business from the East Coast partner, you're going to get a little slice of business, a little cut of the business as well. So if you're a savvy enough partner that you're kind of doing both ends of that, and I've got an example of that in a few slides, that can be pretty profitable for you. So that's really the other key real benefit to the program. So let me just kind of go through those kind of one by one. I've kind of touched on these already at a high level. Number one, now you can grow those revenue streams with zero CapEx risk, meaning it's all OpEx based, right? Again, like I said, we do not do CapEx business. This is all part of an OpEx based offerings, as I mentioned on that first slide. So you can grow your revenue scale without the need to build those new data centers or form, hyperscale partnerships or deploy colo. it's all on demand, again, just paid for usage. And now you can, as I mentioned that last week, you can earn them, that last example, you can earn them not only when you sell your existing customer base, but also on consumption of services in your zone by other solution providers around the world. And again, I'll show you an example of what I mean by that. You can deliver new global products and services now because you'll have a larger kind of pool of equipment you could access. And then now you could potentially compete and win versus public cloud providers. There may have been instances in the past, like I said, where you had to walk away from business, but now you have a network of partners and technologies you can access to maybe go after those kind of bids and businesses that you haven't bid in before, which is great. We say embrace the familiar because it's all through Zadara technology, so it's not like you're accessing new technologies or you have to worry about anything different about the offering, because as a Zadara partner, you're well familiar with our products and offerings with zStorage, zCompute, and networking. So that's the exact same kind of technologies you'll be tapping into through the network. And then, of course, like I said, it's all the same, 100% fully managed by us, supported wherever or whatever deployment the federated edge is. And then the last one, and Dave, I think, kind of touched on this in his slide too. Now, this is maybe more of a European example, but as there are more zones becoming available across the world, you could still keep that data local, or if you need that data local in a certain market, you could have it there accessing the federated edge network. This is, like I said, very big in Europe, very interesting in Europe, but that's just, I'd say, a last benefit that I'd want to highlight. All right, so let me kind of transition it into an example, and this can get a little detailed, and I'm going to try to keep it as high level, but I think it's worthwhile to kind of talk through. And I've used some of these terms before, but so kind of starting at the bottom, the platform provider, the technology is always Zadara. It's always based on Zadara, zStorage, zCompute, or networking, regardless of where in the world it is. It's always going to be our technology because it's our program and network of partners that it accesses. On the right, the zone and FE zone is just that kind of physical deployment. So as I mentioned earlier, I think I called them clouds when I showed that slide. But once you're in the partner program, any of your physical deployments that are Zadara based then become what we refer to as an FE zone. So you could be a single partner with multiple sites, then you'd have multiple FE zones that you would open up to be in the federated edge program. So then on the top left, the solution provider versus operator. Basically, if you're in the federated edge program as a partner, you're going to kind of be both of these. It's kind of just a term we use, but the solution provider is like the local provider selling that business to their customers, whereas the operator would be on the opposite end of the opposite end of that transaction. That would maybe be that distant zone operator that provides the services. And I'll get into an example to really kind of drill that point home. But that's kind of the terms that we toss around. So let me just give a quick example to kind of help illustrate some of the benefits and also what we mean with these terms. So like I said, so let's say, well, actually this is based on an actual partner discussion we've been having. This is a provider on the East Coast, Southeast, so Florida area in the US. They're actually in the medical field or a healthcare provider, and what they do is they're in the business of storing and serving up high quality medical images, so MRIs, CT scans. Up until now, the way they've worked, or the way their business is operated, is that they put in physical resources in the hospital in each of the locations of their customers that they work with, and all those images are stored locally to serve up. And as they're growing and as their own customers are growing, that has a lot of challenges for them. Least of all is just keeping the hardware up to date, swapping out bad hard drives when they need to be changed, doing software upgrades. It's really costly, and they've been looking at a cloud-based solution for a while, but the hyperscalers are just really expensive for them, and it's been a bit of a challenge. So we've been talking to them for a bit, and it's really a nice match for them, this federated edge model, for what they want to do. So, the other limitation is if they wanted to grow outside of Florida, because they've got business up in the Midwest, mid-Atlantic states like Maryland. They've even got some potential business up in the New York metropolitan area. That's also a real challenge for them too. So that's why this model seems very interesting and potential, has a lot of potential for them. So yeah, so when we've been talking to them about joining, so let's use them as an example. So they would be the solution provider, let's say based in Florida, and they've got a hospital or customer based in Florida that maybe has other or needs up in the New York area. So they need to access images that were taken in a Florida hospital, but maybe that's while the person was visiting, but they're going to need access to them up in the New York metropolitan area. Well, instead of putting new installation in those hospitals or doctors' offices in the northeastern New York area, they could access the Federated Edge network, find an operator in that area, and just have those images readily available at the lower latencies that they need up in that area. So potentially, here's an example, you'd have one of their operators be up in the New York area, maybe another one in the Maryland Mid-Atlantic area, and then even another operator, say maybe like in southern Florida, like the Miami area, that they could access all through the Federated Edge network, and they didn't have to physically deploy those resources in those different regions. So that's a nice example. So again, the last point I want to mention, or two more points actually. One of them being, so that term, the solution provider, is this local business based in Florida, providing the MRIs, and then the operators are the Federated Edge partners at those different physical locations that are opening up services on their installations for use of this solution provider, and it's all through the Federated Edge program. So that's what those terms mean. Again, a partner can be both a solution provider and an operator at the same time, and most probably end up will be, but it's just a term we use to differentiate how the transaction works. And then the last thing I wanted to reinforce too, I mentioned this earlier, is that as you see the little dollar signs on here, whether you're a solution provider or an operator, you get a cut of this business. So again, if you're actually if you're participating as both an operator and solution provider, then you can potentially make business on both aspects. And if you're an operator, you've got business coming in that you didn't necessarily even kind of have to work for. It's just like a virtuous benefit of being the Federated Edge network that that you could get. So it's really very interesting. We've got a lot of potential here. So that's kind of at a high level how something like this would work and the benefits that you'd reap by being part of this Federated Edge program with Zadara. Okay, so we're going to take a quick pause here. I've been talking a lot. Dave talked a decent amount. I want to see if there's any questions that came in, address those, or if you guys have, while I'm looking through those, if you guys have any quick questions, please use that Q&A function to put those in there. One question I got, sorry, I didn't talk about this at all. Yeah, the question is, does it cost anything to be a part of this Federated Edge program? The answer to that is no. It's really like an extension of being a Zadara partner, and that's how we've been structuring them now. As partners have entered the program, if you're an existing partner of Zadara's and you're interested in joining the Federated Edge program to participate in this this model, yeah, it's just really like an addendum that you sign. We want to make sure that your infrastructure is up to snuff, because obviously you can imagine it's got to be a pretty robust data center that it's in to be able to offer these services that's reliable and performs with the low latency that folks are expecting. So anyway, we've got like a checklist we walk through, an addendum that we sign. If you're a new customer, yeah, sorry, new partner, yeah, you're just kind of onboarded through our normal program. You sign the normal contract with Zadara as a partner, and then you have this what we call the FE addendum. That's also part of that process. But yeah, no charge to be part of FE. It's just part of the normal kind of contract if you want to be with Zadara. So that's how that process works on the Zadara side. Dave, I was going to ask one thing I think someone's interested in understanding is back to some of the stuff you were talking about at a high level around Edge and the demand you're seeing. Do you see any vertical concentration? In other words, are there some verticals that are more interested and have more kind of proclivity to Edge or Edge infrastructures than others? Or do you have any observations in regards to verticals, industry focus there?
Yeah, sure, Steve. As I mentioned, it is easy to sort of paint with a broad brush and say that, everybody, has a place where they can leverage edge technology, but there definitely are some concentrations where we're seeing it more than others. And, a lot of it aligns with kind of those two key concepts, like whether the customer is really concerned about the performance side of things, or whether they're concerned about the sort of the security or compliance side of things, or and actually in many cases, some elements of both. And so I mentioned manufacturing earlier, or any of those kind of, you can almost put them under the category of industrial, right? And I say that because these are the types of people that have a lot of real-time processes. So whether it's, the manufacturers, or whether it's even in oil and gas, or you see this in like logistics and transportation, these are areas where, back to some of those earlier comments, things like low latency for applications is incredibly important. Being able to sort of reduce some of those communication costs between sites, I think, is important as well. So that sort of movement of data. So those for sure are one area. Also see a lot of uptick in retail. A lot of that is driven by the fact that again, these are kind of operations where, if the cloud goes down, they still need to be able to operate. And in many cases, these are also very distributed organizations, right? So you're talking about, I might be a retailer with 1,000 outlets, and those 1,000 outlets are going to be spread either across the country or across the world. And so, getting back to some of the issues where I think the public cloud providers have is they just, self-admittedly don't have, infrastructure in all the places where people need it. And so the challenge then gets put back on the customer to say, well, I guess I can kind of cobble together, my own sort of, infrastructure in different places, and which is a huge burden for them. And something that I think, the federated edge has an ability to address. And then, I guess finally, there's that also kind of like heavy concentration of data, like your example in the medical field with these, MRI images, or any of that, sort of, large data sets that are being generated. The other place, which sort of somewhat adjacent to that, is pharmaceuticals and things like that, where I did an interview with somebody, and like these like genomic sequencing machines just produce tons and tons of data, and they need that to stay within, sort of the regional area where they are. They might be sharing it with other hospitals within a city, or things like that. But just another example of where, that centralized model doesn't work so well, and this distributed approach is required.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And we see some similar kind of use cases and models like that on our side. So yeah, thank you. I appreciate that perspective. All right, guys, let's just kind of, I've got a summary slide here just to wrap things up. Thanks again for your attendance today. Just to kind of sum up, as Dave mentions, edge is becoming a real strategic imperative. It's a top priority for many of those C-suite executives, and they see it as critical to the success of their strategic business objectives. Dave had some good data, I thought, on the slides where he was talking about kind of the growth and just the market size expectations of where things are going to be even just 4 years from now. So a lot of interest and growth around edge. And then I think we both saw, both Dave and myself here at Zadara have seen that, MSPs need help, and they've got a limited profitable options for their growth. And so what we're doing at Zadara, both our technology and this federated edge program, can really help MSPs. And I think just to sum up a couple of key points I was talking about earlier, is can really help grow new revenue streams without that CapEx reach. It can extend the geographical reach of some of the areas that MSPs can cover relatively easily. What I mean by that is without the investment and leveraging or tapping into, I should say, the federated edge network and program network of partners. And then, it also gives MSP partners now a stronger real option to compete and win against public cloud providers for that business that may be outside of where they're geographically kind of focusing now. So thanks again, guys. We really just kind of scratched the surface, both on our technologies as well as this FE program. So I want to please encourage you to check out our website, or also zadara.com/FE for more information on the federated edge. And if you are a partner interested in joining, there's a big check out that /FE site. There's a description there, and there's a link to kind of reach out and talk to us about joining. And if you want to chat more, you've got more questions at Zadara, we'd love to chat with you. So please reach out using info@zadara.com. We want to hear from you, and we're looking forward to work with you. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks again for your time today. We appreciate it. We hope this was informative, and it was our pleasure talking with you today. Thanks again, and have a great day.